Good afternoon, all. Welcome to today's cybersecurity webinar presented by Synoptek. Today, we're going to discuss the evolution of threats and a more holistic approach to cybersecurity. This is not a product pitch webinar. This is a discussion of real-world findings and the appropriate mechanisms that your organizations need to have in place to thwart attacks. A few house cleaning items before we get started today. Our audience is encouraged to submit questions into the lower chat box on the left. We have cybersecurity experts manning the chat box that are prepared to answer your questions at any point during the webinar. Now to introduce today's speakers. Mark Mooring is our cybersecurity regional manager. Mark has helped organizations of all sizes implement customized cybersecurity strategies to achieve a more mature security and IT posture. Mark's industry experience extends into the healthcare, financial, tech, and nonprofit verticals. John Avery is Synoptek's lead cybersecurity advisor and analyst. John has helped hundreds of our clients protect the security and integrity of their most critical data. John's day-to-day typically includes virtual chief information security advisory, preventing, detecting, and combating cybersecurity threats. Now for today's webinar, Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Tyler. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Glad you can make it and learn a little bit more about our perspective on cybersecurity. So to start off today, I'd like to start off with an analogy. What makes a professional golfer? Is it the professional grade equipment that he's sponsored by, or is it his swing? So today we think that is very much indicative of how folks in the world are procuring their IT systems and security products. They focus too much on product, less on process, and they try to solve everything through procurement. Today we're going to talk about how we're seeing process become more of a focus point for the hacking community when they're targeting organizations. To further illustrate our points today, we're going to reference data that we looked at from the top 50 major breaches of 2016. About 1.8 billion records were lost in total, but today we're going to focus on the 72%, which represents the vast majority of those breaches, which accounted for organizational process and people failures, while only 28% of those records accounted for inadequate security technologies. During the presentation, we're going to cover things why IT configuration accounted for 322 million records lost, all the way down to social engineering, while that represents 250 million records lost. And then we'll also have a look at the insider threat, as well as failure to fully implement security products. So, we see this as a big issue, but John, do you think it's only an issue for large enterprises?
I actually think that this is an issue for organizations of any size.
Right, and when we see even the smaller businesses being targeted, they're also falling victim to these things and going out of business very fast. So we're going to also just jump into why this is a bigger issue for most, not just small, medium businesses. So why is that? Well, we're noticing that organizations are focusing too much on products. And while that's a great, in theory, the challenge is that products don't really help improve process. They're more or less band-aids that folks are trying to put in place because of a broken process. However, we help organizations realize what that broken process looks like. So we're going to talk a little bit about today how products can introduce more problems and hurt an organization's growth path to maturing a process rather than just buying more products. And then how do those products help process and enable policy? Those are critical things today that we're helping organizations realize and gain value out of the tools that they're implementing. And then also touch on why hackers are targeting more process-oriented data breaches and hacks, mostly because 0 days are very hard to construct and very expensive and time-consuming to target. And with patching and updates being so readily available, hackers are starting to focus on the bigger vulnerability, the human element and broken process. So why is this a challenge today? Well, majority of breaches happen and organizations do have firewalls and AVs in place. So why is it such a challenge? Well, there's a number of ways a hacker can get in. Everything from a simple USB drive to an email, or even just your own employee could ruin an organization. So we're going to talk a lot about this today and how it's hard for an organization to just buy products to try to protect themselves against a new world of threats. Social engineering, which accounted for 226 million records lost in 2016 when we reviewed the top 50 major breaches, seems to be one of the most popular attacks because it's very inexpensive for a hacker to create, easy to target organizations that fall victim to these types of things, and very low-level crimes electronically allow them to escape away with a lot of intellectual property or capital. So why is that? Well, we see password policies continuing to be very lackadaisical and poorly implemented, and that accounts for a big challenge of why users are falling victim to phishing attacks. So we're also going to jump into a little bit more about the anatomy of phishing, and we're going to hand it over to John Avery.
Very much appreciate it, Mark. Thank you. You know, I am actually a really big fan of spear phishing attacks because they're just oftentimes so clever. And so I'm going to walk everyone through the anatomy of a spear phishing attack, and starting with step number 1, where the hacker or threat actor targets a company. They're searching for and collecting data that can help him or her build a profile of their target company. Step 2, the attacker expands on the organization's profile to individual key targets of opportunity, typically C-levels or network admins. Step 3, our hacker is going to carefully craft a fake but convincing email using the collage of information he or she previously scraped together. Step 4, the email is going to be sent to a target within the organization containing either a link or an attachment. And step 5, that email is going to pass your spam filter, and it does so because it's writing low and slow. This attacker is not sending bulk messages. And of course, step 6, the email is opened because why not? It looks and feels like an email that they would expect to get from anybody else that may be connected to this individual. And step 7, at this point, we're done. We're cooked. The link is clicked or the attachment is opened, and it's game over. And then, of course, after that, the attacker is going to either exfiltrate data or pivot to someone else.
Hey, but John, wouldn't we see this coming with some of the technologies that we have in place?
You know, Mark, that's a really good question, and many people might think so, but we were actually made aware of an incident recently that occurred with a high-profile individual at an organization that were the targets of a very carefully laid out plan for a spear phishing campaign. This individual, their child, unfortunately, was in a situation at their elementary school that went under an active shooter situation. And the attackers were just waiting for the prime opportunity such as this to send that carefully crafted email message to the CEO. And unfortunately, of course, the CEO, they were very well versed in security, but they still fell victim because, of course, of the nature of the attack.
When we look at the insider threat, there's a number of things contributing to the insider threat, and we look at it in about 3 different categories. So why is it important? Well, 254 million records were lost out of the top 50 breaches of 2016. And of them, in those 3 categories, we noticed that 62% of these insiders were actually financially motivated to do something, which is a quite staggering number. 29% of those employees actually just walked out blatantly. There's cases where these individuals are trying to take certain customer contact lists for a future job. The other 9% of these users represented a very malicious, harmful intent to do some destructive behavior back to the organization. And we have a story from John about a recent engagement during a hiring and offboarding of an employee.
Yeah, this one was really interesting. This individual fell into a couple of these buckets, as it turns out. They ended up siphoning off large amounts of data, shutting down servers, and installing backdoors all over this environment. The organization had to send home all of their employees for a couple of days on end. And what was interesting is during our investigation, we saw that on this individual's Facebook profile, their favorite quote clearly states that it's better to burn than to fade away. So I would encourage everyone on this webinar to, make sure that when you're vetting your employees during onboarding or exit, that if you see something like this, you take some extra steps of precaution.
The other part of the insider threat is really sad because it can be avoided, and that's the troubling aspect of it. But employee negligence really hurts an organization, and it's because of a number of reasons. Employees necessarily procure or buy the equipment that they're handed, so they don't own it. They're not necessarily going to feel as secure about it as if it was not their equipment or their own. So what we've seen is just misuse of a number of things, from misappropriately storing equipment to sharing information with third parties that you shouldn't be, or even things like the use of Tor, which just so happens to bring me to an image down on the bottom left where an employee was using the Tor browser to access the dark web for illegal content. And the terrifying thing is the user was actually connected into critical systems that could potentially expose the organization to the dark web. And while he's connected to the dark web, 5,000 individual users on the dark web were actually connected and pivoting off that customer's network. Some very terrifying things that we're coming across. Another side of this is the inner threat because of the BYOD piece here. BYOD, a lot of users like their own devices, and it's very difficult to manage. So we're seeing a lot of BYOD policies and practices being very immature. And the biggest challenge with BYOD is organizations don't have the ability to manage or control things like updates, which are very critical. Critical updates and patches account for a very large number of breaches. I think it's north of 75% from last year. And what's scary about that is we came across an executive, a C-level executive who brought his iPad in and was unupdated and patched. And the sad thing was his device was actually communicating both with a Korean telecom and a Russian telecom, and some hacker was scanning the network and trying to scrape the corporate network for data. And we were able to find that and detect it very fast, but had we not been there, that little device could have brought his whole company to their demise. John's going to help us kind of evaluate why vendor risk management is a critical piece to a cybersecurity operation.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself. In the new and forthcoming digital age, third-party vendor risk management is really at the forefront of information security. As depicted here in this image, every business and organization of any size really leverages many different types of third-party relationships to perform and facilitate a lot of different functions. We were actually involved, Mark, if you recall, with another client engagement where they had a vendor risk issue. And as it turns out, while we were on site with this client, they were visited by a separate vendor who made the fateful decision to connect his laptop to this organization's public Wi-Fi. And then as we saw, if you recall, that individual proceeded to reach out to the dark web over their Tor client. That's just a big no-no. This client really, what was interesting and struck me as odd is they didn't really seem to mind until exactly 1 week later, it was discovered that the public Wi-Fi at this client site and their core network were mistakenly merged when the vendor rep revisited. The internal data became exposed. And of course, this vendor was acting as the middleman. This is a clear breakdown in process.
Which brings me to my next point, the breakdown in process and IT misconfigurations, and why there's such a staggering number of 325 million records lost due to the simple fact that IT misconfigurations are in place. And again, these are avoidable practices. Let's talk about getting back to the basics. Backups. A lot of backup processes are very immature, and they don't even test. The organizations aren't even testing them. Also, updates, patches. Let's talk about that. 60% of vulnerabilities were due to that. These types of things are leading organizations to a bad practice, and it'll continue to replicate unless it's quickly addressed. A couple points here. We came across an organization who had used a vendor that they just so happened to not properly vet, and that vendor was not performing proper updates to the VoIP phones that they included as a part of their VoIP service. And the client had about 200 to 500 of these devices installed, and they were not being patched and updated regularly. And we came across a number of devices that were infected with shell shock and had included the corporate devices into a botnet army. And these types of incidences don't really do too well in a public-facing type company. So we helped that client address that by notifying the vendor to start taking care of their systems and regularly patch and update them. Another sad aspect of this is just the challenge with employing proper individuals with the right tools and the right education and background. And there's a combination of issues here. One is there's a labor challenge. In California alone, for every one cybersecurity expert that is employed, there's 9 vacancies. And so that kind of shows you why this slide is really important. One, an organization is trying to use too much product and they don't have the right individuals from both bandwidth or skill sets perspective to properly implement security tools, align them to architecture, compliance regulations, etc. Another part of it is they just don't have the people, and not having the people means that you have individuals who are not equipped to install things, and they really mislead the organization and suggest that they do have the proper tools in place, but they're just not catching everything. Another area that is scary for us and sad is that HR doesn't really see cybersecurity as much as IT, but we're also seeing now that HR is starting to pay a lot of attention to it, and the onboarding process has got to improve with regard to that. So we're seeing proper education being implemented early on by making the user aware of what type of access and systems they'll be using and the sensitivity of it and how to properly conduct and utilize those systems while they're in the field or on site. Another area which is not so enjoyable to discuss but is very much a necessary piece is the employee exit process. We came across an organization who had a very poor process of ensuring that a user was properly removed from all the systems, meaning the access and user credentials. And then we later find out that some of those user credentials are still being utilized and accessed from an employee that may have not been there from 6 to 12 months. And that is terrifying because you have no ability to identify who is taking things and what from old credentials. Finally, I would like to end and talk a little bit about the smaller percentage, but why it's such a challenge. 28% of the total data breaches last year, when evaluated, accounted because of inadequate security technologies. The challenge here that we're seeing is that legacy technologies that are based on rules and signatures are no longer doing the job, and more devices, users, data is being transmitted across an organization. So now on to us to start looking at things that are more into the detection. And so Synoptek has really started to take a focus and help organizations realize that traditional-based technologies are no longer meeting the need and are unable to see behaviors taking place from within the network and working our way out. So we'd be happy to work with you and talk to you a little bit more about our perspective. I'm going to hand it back over to Tyler, and thanks again for joining John and I today on this webinar.
Thanks, Mark. You and John really demonstrated today that organizations really are facing that new wave of dynamic attackers using adaptable technology, stealth techniques, anything they can to infiltrate an organization at its weakest point. I'd like to cover this slide a bit here. Synoptek. So who is Synoptek? What do we do? What's our play in IT security? Synoptek was originally founded in Irvine, California in 2001. The core competency of the organization is to provide strategic IT leadership and operational support for customers around the world. Synoptek can extend the capacity of your IT team with easy-to-consume IT services that do not require large upfront investments. This is very important for cybersecurity. So some areas that Synoptek helps fill in the gaps. Mark touched a bit about the talent gaps. There's openings. It's hard to find that good security talent and also retain that talent when you do have it. So Synoptek can come in, provide that gap of talent. We have a number of cybersecurity experts helping to develop policy, maintenance, install business continuity planning and disaster recovery, helping organizations to meet compliance requirements and regulations. Also, a bit on what John touched on, the vendor risk management aspect. So Synoptek can work not only with your organization to help build a better security posture there, but also with your third-party vendors, making sure that they have proper procedures, policies in place, and training if they're handling your data, you want to make sure that that is secure. Also working with Synoptek, you get to have regular meetings with folks like Mark and John to review and educate your teams on security and install a risk mitigation program. One of the main pieces that we touched on today that you all saw some of the screenshots there. So Synoptek works with many organizations, again, analyzing their information environment. We are able to detect anomalous activity and stop it before it develops into a devastating. So we want to thank everyone again for attending today's webinar. If you are interested in trying Synoptek's Network Anomaly Detection Program, we are offering all attendees a 30-day proof of value, no cost to use. Simply enter POV in your chat box and we will reach out to you. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day.